my lunch. Well, welcome to the School of Health Professions Leadership Series. And today we have the speaker who is visiting us from the Netherlands. And when I finish reading his official bio, I will give you the unofficial one. And let me start by saying Professor Martijn Spruit is the Interim Director of Research and Development at CIRO, a specialized pulmonary rehabilitation center in Hoorn, the Netherlands. He is a full professor in rehabilitation sciences at Maastricht University in the Netherlands as well, and Hasselt University in Belgium. Professor Spruit has published more than 265 peer-reviewed articles on pulmonary rehabilitation, physical activity, and extrapulmonary treatable traits in patients with chronic lung disease. He was the lead author on the 2013 ATS-ERS State on Pulmonary Rehabilitation. The European Respiratory Society awarded him the Society's COPD Research Award in 2013. He became a fellow of the Society in 2016, and the American Association for Cardiovascular and Pulmonary Rehabilitation awarded him the 2019 Thomas L. Petty Distinguished Pulmonary Scholar Award. Do you have more? Oh. Well, I don't know when he had time to gather all of this, but for sure, I met the speaker in 1999 when we were both, we were both accepted into a master's program at the Catholic University of Leuven. And at that time, I had hair on my head, and he always terrorized me with his height. And the first thing he said when he saw me, again, after a very long time, is like, "Oh, now I can look into your head." And I said, "Stop it." It's not my fault that he keeps growing taller. I just can't catch up with him. But Dr. Spruit has always been a very good colleague and someone. One of the reasons I invited him is I am not surprised with what he has gone on to accomplish, because this was a vision he had cut out from himself when we were students together. I spent my time elsewhere in the city center. I'm not going to tell you what I was doing in the city center. And as far back as that time, he was fixated on writing to journals with very high impact factor. And then he would get publications like in Thorax, in British Medical Journal, and he will send it to me and say, "Hey, have you heard?" And I got that. And I won't tell you what response I gave back, but it was something like buzz off, But, it's just been a pleasure to see what he's gone on to accomplish all the years. And today, he will be talking about faster alone, further together. And I think it's all about collaboration and how much he has done with that. And in leadership, we sure do need that. So please join me in welcoming Professor Martijn Spruit. Okay, now don't measure the height.
Look at the difference. I'll turn off the main light. I think you still can see me. Dear Mr. Dean, or I used to call him Emmanuel. I don't know why, but that's your second name. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'd also like to thank all your colleagues for the warm welcome I already had in the past 36 hours. And I've been asked to talk about my career and how I became a leader within the field of pulmonary rehab. And to talk for an hour about myself is a little bit awkward. So I tried to do a little bit of a mix of my career and also some content of the publications we published. But the title is Faster Alone and Further Together. And I seriously believe in that. I think you really have to collaborate with different partners, with different disciplines, to go much further than you can come alone. A very quick overview of my academic career. I obtained my bachelor degree in Amsterdam in 1999. Then I continued to Leuven in Belgium, where I met the dean. I got 2 scholarships. And this is the main square in Leuven. This is where I used to stay as a student. And this was my view. And the distance to the bars was about 200 meters. So the dean was telling that I was not drinking and partying. Well, that's wrong. I did on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday evening. So even if you go out and have fun, you can still have a nice career after that. Then I obtained my master's degree in Leuven. I worked as a physical therapist for a while, for a few months in the university hospital at the medium care in the oncology department, because I knew in January 2001 I was going to start my Ph.D. project, which I completed in October 2004. Then I worked as a postdoctoral fellow, and then I moved back to Holland, where I originally come from. I work already almost 15 years in Siro, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. I was appointed as associate professor in Hasselt, then full professor in Maastricht, and full professor again in Hasselt. And all those different steps I will touch upon during my talk. Because I was asked to look back over time, and I'm 45 years of age, but if you look back to my academic career, it already started almost 20 years ago. And I feel like an old man talking about it. So I have to give you an overview of the last 20 years, and I have to summarize that in about 15 minutes. Which is impossible. So I take some highlights. Most failures I leave away. So I started my career in Leuven. I did my PhD and 1 year of postdoctoral fellow. And this is the cover of my PhD thesis. It was entitled The Effects of Exercise Training and Acute Exacerbations on Muscle Function in Patients with Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease. And when I arrived in Leuven, I hardly knew the definition of COPD. I, of course, found out that it's a smoking-induced disease, mostly, for sure in Western countries. There's different clinical features, but mostly it's a combination of chronic bronchitis and emphysema. And if you look very carefully, this is healthy lung tissue, this is damaged lung tissue, so this is emphysema, and those patients have a lot of mucus, most probably. They have dyspnea, first at exercise, then at rest. Some have cough, some have sputum. But we as physical therapists may also look at their activity levels. And when they're physically inactive, they have a loss of physical functioning. So one of the ideas is we do exercise training. And at the time when I started my PhD, endurance training was very common. Well, we thought that resistance training would be much more feasible and more effective. And the other hypothesis we had, like if those patients are admitted to the hospital because of an exacerbation of their disease, they are very inactive in a catabolic inflammatory status. What's the effect on the muscles? So those 2 questions we addressed, amongst others, in my PhD thesis. They were both published in good journals, and behind each reference I write the number of citations that I could find yesterday in the Web of Science, just to show you that some works are well cited, and others a little bit less, unfortunately. But these are 2 of my top 10 papers. The first one was on resistance training. And we randomized patients with COPD to resistance training, 12 weeks, or endurance training. I won't go into all the details, but what we found out is that the change in exercise performance, measured with a walking test, or a cycling test, or a quality of life questionnaire, was very similar between both training modalities. So we showed that exercise training, resistance training, is safe, and that it's equally as effective as endurance training. Well, we also found if those patients are admitted to the hospital and you measured at day 3 of admission and day 8 of admission their muscle function, there's on average a 6% decline. So those patients are already weak, and each day you see the quadriceps muscle strength decline with about 1%. And the interesting thing of this paper, besides that it's published in Thorax, one of the main journals, it was also the paper with my first accompanying editorial. And I was really happy with that. Which means that your peers really appreciate what you did and think it's novel. In fact, they say the study by Spruit and colleagues raises the intriguing hypothesis that frequent exacerbators, so those patients who are admitted frequently to the hospital, might have a more rapid decline in quadriceps strength. And I was very proud by that. I think it's an honor when people start to recognize that in an editorial. and some others were to follow. In fact, this is a reference not from our group, so that's not colored blue. So all the references that colored blue are from our group. Those are colored reddish are from others. Because the gentleman who wrote this editorial, Mike Polke, we gave him the idea to start an exercise training study. And he directly started with this study, where patients who were just discharged from the hospital did exercise training or usual care, and there's a huge impact on the exercise performance and the quality of life of those patients. So our work, my work of my PhD thesis, was the basis for others to start up research, to get grants, and so on. Which gave me also the boost that the work we were doing was very valuable. And during the PhD program, I think we have to, as a researcher, we have to develop ourselves as independent researchers. We have to write scientific articles. And the dean was already referring to my habit. If there was a top journal, like the New England Journal, and they published something within my domain, I scrutinized that paper, and if possible, I wrote a letter to the editor, which sometimes was accepted, just to point out that I was a very critical scientist. I gave presentations at conferences, I got scientific awards, I did some teaching duties, but I also had personal growth. And the travel distance between where I used to live, near Amsterdam, and Leuven, was about 2.5 hours. So I used to live here, and I moved to Leuven. And then you would consider that's not too much, and there are not so many cultural differences, but there were a lot of cultural differences, which I had to overcome. Also, perseverance was tested. I give you an example. We did in the first 9 months of my PhD project, we obtained more than 100 muscle biopsies of the vastus lateralis muscle from patients in a clinical stable state during exacerbation in healthy subjects. But after 9 months, I got a phone call that the freezer defrosted. All the samples were lost. We only needed 5 more samples to complete the study. That was really a shock. But it also makes you stronger. I also had personal growth. Some was done during my PhD, and some after that. But these are my 3 daughters. Well, an older photo, because they were produced in 2004, 6, and 8. So there's also, besides doing science, you can also build up your private life. And after your PhD trajectory, you have to question, do you want to go into academics or you want to go somewhere else? Well, I was bitten by the virus of the academic world. I want to continue in that world. And if you then look at the postdoctoral trajectories, most scientists go abroad. They go to a different country, to a different university, to experience how things are organized there. I didn't want to do that, because I went from Holland to Belgium, and I was already in a foreign country. My aim was to challenge myself and to go to the intensive care unit, because I saw in the intensive care unit that the impact of prolonged mechanical ventilation was huge. And those patients who are in the intensive care, their muscles melt away. So I wanted to stay in Leuven and want to work at the intensive care unit. But unfortunately, I didn't get the grants I wanted. So I had to leave Leuven. In Leuven, I did realize that I don't have to be a medical doctor to be successful within the field of health sciences. And I had a great example. I had 2 supervisors for my PhD thesis. One was Mark de Kramer, a chest physician. The other one was Rick Gosling, who you see here on the photo. And Rick Gosling was also a physical therapist by background. And at the end, he was even the vice chancellor of the University of Leuven. He was chair of the department, dean of the faculty, and then even vice chancellor. But he was also very successful in his science. So he convinced me also, it was a great example that you don't have to be a medical doctor to be very successful. But I also like to point out, it's very handy to know the best doctor within your field of expertise to make the chances in your career even better. So you have to find the balance there. And as you can see here, I did my PhD, I completed my PhD in October 2004. And about half a year in advance, there was a workshop in Leuven. And my promoter, my supervisor, asked me to give a talk there. And in the audience was this man, this doctor, Professor Wouters, Emil Wouters. And he was really top of the bill within pulmonary rehab. And during the presentation I gave, he was writing all kinds of things, but he didn't make any notes about my talk. He wrote down my name and my email address, and he contacted me afterwards, and he recruited me to move to Zero. So, after 5 years of Leuven, I moved to Zero. And I'll show you on the globe where it is located. just to make sure that, because the taxi driver thought that Amsterdam was the capital city of Paris, so we have some problems there. I tried to convince him that's not the case, but okay, that's... So you will see we move slowly towards Holland. And in the southeast part of Holland, there's a small city. It used to be an old tuberculosis center, so it's hidden in the woods. But now it's a high-tech, state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, in particular for patients with COPD and chronic heart failure. Here you see Holland, Belgium. We end up somewhere here in the southeast. Here we go. There it is. My office is somewhere here, so now you know everything. But the great thing about coming to CEDO is the following. It opened many doors for me. And I will explain you why. Because the board of directors already 15 years ago had a vision that you had to integrate science into daily clinical practice. So we had to gather data, clinical data, in daily clinical routine. And new findings of research had to be brought back to the daily clinical practice. So there were fantastic facilities. Everything you can think of is there. There was a vision and many opportunities. In the last 15 years, I was part of this journey of clinical data analysis and publications. Because the vision we have there is that it's much more important to know what sort of a patient has a disease than what sort of a disease a patient has. We need to understand the human, the whole patient, and not the disease on its own. I give you an example of that. These are some data from our clinic. The FEV1, most of you know that, a marker of disease severity in patients with COPD. This is the 6-minute walk distance. There's some positive correlation. But if you select the patients with an FEV1 of around 1 liter, this patient can only walk 50 meters. This one can go above 600 meters in 6 minutes. So the degree of airflow limitation only gives you a small explanation why those patients experience exercise intolerance. And the same for quality of life. The St. George questionnaire, a lower score means a better quality of life. If I select the same patients, these patients have a rather good quality of life, while these patients with the same poor lung function have an impaired quality of life. So the patient is much more than the lung function impairment. There's much more to that. It's the United Colors of COPD, we call it. So we need an integrated assessment. And the last 15 years, I've been working on that with my colleagues, with the researchers, with the PIs and the Ph.D. students, how we can characterize those patients. So most chest physicians probably look at this patient only from a lung function perspective. The degree of airflow limitation, diffusion capacity, the degree of static and dynamic hyperinflation. But if you zoom in and you look at this patient, he has abnormal low muscle mass, muscle weakness, loss of muscle endurance, common comorbidities. He has cognitive impairments. Half of them have symptoms of anxiety, depression, poor exacerbation management skills, poor coping skills. The patient's environment, for example, partners, spouses are still smoking, and in an unhealthy lifestyle, and so on. This is a complete picture of your patient. And based on all those treatable traits, you may build up a very personalized treatment program. Because we know from different studies, and you see a few of them mentioned here in the right bottom corner, that all these different aspects can contribute to their daily symptoms, to their poor health status, their exercise intolerance, the risk of being admitted to the hospital, and even the poor prognosis. So in CEDO, we build up a very high process-based rehab program, which means that the patients are referred to us for pulmonary rehab by a medical specialist. And then they are assessed. In 2.5 days, we do the baseline intake and assessment. We measure all the different physical, emotional, and social treatable traits. And based on that, we make a comprehensive rehab program, which is evaluated at the end of the program. Because we aim for personalized COPD care. We want to have the right treatment for the right patient, at the right moment, for the right outcomes. This is what we're aiming for. But to achieve that, we are already working on that for more than 15 years. And work and combine research and clinic in the same institute. To do that, you also need a very dedicated pulmonary rehab team. It has to be multidisciplinary. And yesterday I saw your fantastic facilities for the interprofessional teaching. I think that's something that's really a step forward. All my colleagues are currently working in Zero, don't have that background, but they're very dedicated, very skilled to treat their patients we see in our clinic. And besides that, we have planning and control, the research, and also quality engineering. And if you look at the literature, you may think, oh, this is very normal. Every center has this. But that's not true. We did a survey a few years ago, and then you see that some rehab teams consist of only one member. Most of them are around 4 to 5 different types of health disciplines, some above 10. So I'm feeling very lucky and privileged that I work at Zero, where we can combine the research and the clinical practice. If you then look over time, there are some time points which made a very big difference in my career. As a postdoc, I knew I had to have some skills. And I'd like to address some of those skills because they helped me to become the leader that I'm currently am. You have to be a highly motivated, enthusiastic researcher, and you have to have earning power. Because those researchers who have the money can decide the program. So in the last years, I obtained a lot of funding from charity organizations, from the university, from the Dutch government, from the European Respiratory Society, pharmaceutical industry, and so on. And every time I try to hire somebody who's smarter than myself. That's so important, because then it's the only way that you can learn more. So, for example, we hired an engineer who's doing fantastic statistics on data, and look at oxygen kinetics, which I myself don't have as a skill. But he's doing those analyses, and together we write a paper on that. It's a fantastic result. And by having the funding, you can hire people, and that's what you need. Because I know there's a lot of data sets available within Zero, but also all around the world. Smaller and larger data sets. But you need the people and the brains to write it. So currently, based on the funding I obtained, I'm supervising 16 Ph.D. students. And while I'm traveling, they're doing all the hard work. And by having this large group of people around me, and also my colleagues who have different PhD students around them, we have a very broad basis. And these are the last 30 papers that were published and announced on PubMed. Almost every paper has a different first author, a lead author, which means that the basis for our research team is rather broad. And if somebody would leave the team, there are enough to continue the research. I think that's very important. So you can do everything alone, but together you come much further. I also have a wide research interest. Of course, my background is physical therapy. I like exercise physiology, exercise training, and so on. But in my role to supervise PhD students, there are also medical doctors who want to obtain their PhD degree. And they're not so much interested in exercise performance. So I was also the main supervisor of doctors who were focusing on osteoporosis, on palliative care, comorbidities, and adiposity in COPD. I quickly show you one example of Daisy Janssen. Daisy studied she asked doctors, pulmonologists and cardiologists, did you discuss advanced care planning with your patient? And then the doctor said, well, yeah, with 20% of my patients, I discussed that at the outpatient consultation. And for the heart failure patients, 1 out of 6. And then we asked the patient. There's a discrepancy. We don't know who's right and who's wrong. But we do understand, based on these data, that COPD care and heart failure care has to be improved, and communication is an important part of that. By doing these broader types of research projects, you also increase your knowledge, and it's also a broader base to make advancements in your own field. And what about the high international level in the scientific field? You need a strong publication record, you have to be creative, you have to have international leadership. And when I look back over all the data, I was like, when was my first time that I was a senior author? I couldn't remember, I had to look it up. It was in 2008. So one of my PhD students did a study on neuromuscular electrical stimulation, and he looked at the metabolic load during an exercise test, on the cardiopulmonary exercise test, during a session of resistance training, or during a session of high-frequency NMES. And you see that the burden on the respiratory system is much lower if you do high-frequency NMES. So for the most severe dyspneic patients, who are also weak, NMES is a serious treatment option you should consider. But this is my first paper as senior author, which gave me also some kind of seniority. And from there on, it continued, and the number of senior authorships increased tremendously, of course. And what about the strong publication record? On this left side, you see the total number of hits in PubMed, and on the right side, you see the total number of citations in the Web of Science. And over the years, there's a tremendous increase. And that helped me a lot. Because you see, the first 100 papers, it took me almost 10 years to get the first 100 papers. But after that, it took me about 4 years. And I expect around end of 2020 to be around 300 hits in PubMed. Because of that, I also have a lot of citations with the team. You see, we are above on total more than 10,000 citations to our work, which means that the work we're doing is visible, people appreciate that, they cite it, and they use it as a basis for the next steps of research. And based on these publications, you're invited as a researcher, I was invited by different organizations to be in the scientific board. And when you're in the scientific board, you have to read proposals of others. And when you read proposals of others, you start to learn how to write proposals yourself. That's also that's a skill you need to develop. So for example, here with the Dutch Lung Foundation, I was in the scientific advisory board for several years. And also the European Respiratory Society, I had different roles at the assembly level. Now I'm in the executive committee. But this was a perfect timing for me, and I'll explain you why. The last international guideline on pulmonary rehab was published in 2006. And around 2010, there was a discussion ongoing between the European and the American society. We have to update this guideline. Who can we contact? I was one of the officers within the rehab group here, around 2010. And they asked me, do you want to be involved? I was like, oh, sure. Afterwards, I don't know if I would say it again, yes. But then I was like, sure. And it gave me a lot of opportunities, and I'll show you why. It took me almost 3 years of my life, and my employer, Zero, offered me the time and the opportunity to invest that time. Because if your employer does not allow you to use the time for these kind of tasks, you will fail, for sure. So I'm very grateful for the board of directors of Zero to give me that opportunity. Because it took a lot of time. I'm forming a committee to create a task, to choose a team leader, to assemble a board, to hire the best people, to determine the fastest way to deal with the problem. That was more or less the way we worked. Because these were all the task force members. There were 4 co-chairs, I was one of them. But there were about 40 colleagues from all around the world. And before you have consensus with 46 people on, for example, definition of pulmonary rehab, you're almost a year further. And it's a document with 800 references and I don't know how many pages. So only the definition took us almost a year. So you can imagine how much work it is. But it resulted in my top paper. Because of all the work and my ambition, I said, well, I want to write the first draft. Do you agree? Well, the other co-chairs said, sure. They knew already what they said yes to. I didn't realize at that time. It was a lot of work. And also to edit everything and to get all the feedback from all the different co-authors. But we came up with this definition for rehab. So it's a comprehensive intervention based on a thorough patient assessment, followed by patient-tailored therapies, which includes, but are not limited to, exercise training, education, and behavior change. And it's designed to improve the physical and psychological condition of people with chronic respiratory disease and to promote long-term adherence to health-enhancing behaviors. And this paper, it was published in 2013, has been cited more than 1,000 times since it was published. And my visibility was going from here to there. I'll show you a few photos where I've been around the world, and I think mostly this statement was the main reason for that. And if you're successful in completing an international statement, you're invited to be co-chair or member of new statements. And those new statements result in high-impact journals with a lot of visibility. So there was one statement published in 2014 on muscle dysfunction in patients with COPD. But there were also statements on exercise testing and on physical inactivity. So once you have established yourself and you show that you're a reliable partner, you will be invited continuously. And then it goes like this with your publications and your citations. I was already mentioning, if you're increasing your publications and your visibility, you're invited all over the world. And at first I was a little bit scared to do that because you come at places and you eat foods you've never had before. But it's a fantastic experience because you learn a lot from others. And you come in places where they have not so many facilities. And you start to understand their perspective on rehab. In CEDO we have a gym. Fantastic. Everything is there. If you go to Brazil or to the UK, it may be completely different. So my view on the world of pulmonary rehab has changed tremendously by traveling all over the world. But you also have a lot of friends. I don't know, Mr. Dean, do you remember this young man? Fabio Pita? Yeah. So Fabio and I shared our office for 4 years. And he's still a good friend of mine. I travel to Brazil and he travels to me. But also come at other places. London, Firenze, beautiful rehab clinics in Norway. Kyoto, going also to the baseball with my Japanese colleagues. You should enjoy science, but also life. And one thing I really enjoy is sushi, so well, if they invite me to Tokyo, I'm there. I also like to express and emphasize, it's very important to invest time in your colleagues and to show genuine interest. Because there's always a return on investment. And I'll give you one example. My boss asked me to go to a meeting in Birmingham in the UK. It was a meeting where I was on the agenda for 10 minutes. I was like, oh, I'm not going to travel from Amsterdam to Birmingham. It was at the end of the afternoon, so I had to stay over, fly back again. And he said, you have to go. No discussion. I said, okay, I'll go. And then I went to the meeting in Birmingham, and there was the meeting from the Eclipse investigators. And the Eclipse study was a GSK-sponsored study in 42 countries. They assessed more than 2,000 patients with COPD. And at the meeting they said, who wants to write down the data on the 6-minute walk test? Yep, you. So within 10 minutes, I had a database of more than 2,000 patients who were followed up over 3 years. And we could look, for example, at the baseline walk distance and then the mortality rates over 3 years. So you see that those patients who have a walk distance below 100 meters, and within 3 years, about 35% passed away. And you see that gradually it declines when physical fitness is better. And the same is true for hospitalization. So I learned from there, because there were 2 more other papers coming out of that meeting. So I had 3 papers as a result of attending that meeting. And if you get the opportunity or the request to go to a meeting where these things are discussed, I would encourage you to go there and ask your employer to get that opportunity, because the spin-off is tremendous. It's good for your network, and it's good for the science you're doing. So when you do a lot of publications, people start asking you to become member of different boards. And also there you have to make a choice. You have to invest time, but it's worth the effort. For example, the European Lung Foundation has nothing to do with hardcore science. I was in the professional advisory committee of the European Lung Foundation, which is the voice of respiratory patients. So we were advising the ELF about what's good for patients and what's not. I was invited by the U Hasselt to become associate professor and then full professor. I was appointed by Maastricht University. And I'm, for example, a co-chair of national guidelines on COPD and physiotherapy, or on fatigue in chronic disease. And I'm sure in the next few years those number of board meetings will increase. And that has to do, of course, that people recognize the skills and the knowledge that we gather together with our research. What about being visible in general media and lay press? Well, I'll give you one example. I'm sorry this is in Dutch, because we compared the rollator with a walk bike. But these publications were also, we were very much surprised by Reuters, who published some articles on that also, on the same topic. That patients are more mobile with a pedal-less walk bike. So our board of directors was very happy with that, and we're also very happy with it, with the visibility. Of course, we have to be fluent in English. And that's something you really have to do, and you can only practice if you are doing it. So I still remember my first presentation at a ERS meeting in 2000 in Berlin. I had to give a 10-minute abstract talk. I was ready within 3 minutes. I was so nervous. I went, thank you. And I started sweating and terrible. And then the chair, he was in advance, he said, do you have 1 or 2 questions for me I can ask? So I was like, oh, that's nice. But yeah, because I had 7 minutes, there were many other questions. I was like, oh my God, terrible. You learn from that. My highlight is where you go to the ERS or ATS meetings where you can give the year in review meeting, where there are a few thousand people in the room, where your face is projected not only behind you, but throughout the whole room. The first time you do that, you're a little bit nervous, but you get used to that. And then the final part, which I think is very important, is the good team spirit, and in particular my management qualities. And who do I have to manage? Those are highly educated researchers. So they're very smart, and they know what they want. They are ambitious. So I have to listen to them. I also have to coach them. I have to share my knowledge, I have to support them. And very important, for every one of them, I try to create new opportunities. Entrances, to give talks, to get data, and so on. I also give them full credit, always. I don't need an extra paper as first author. If they deserve it, they're first author. And I always put their names at the side of my slide. I give you one example, which has a huge spin-off, with one of our Ph.D. students during lunch. This was the start. Louis van Vleteren, he gathered data of 213 patients with COPD, starting the rehab program, and we objectively assessed 13 common comorbidities. Because we knew that multimorbidity is highly frequently present in our patients. And we had an ID, this was the start on the napkin, and we ended up with this. I'll show you a little bit more details. Because in the literature, the colleagues Barnes and Fabry think that smoking causes systemic inflammation, and systemic inflammation causes all these different diseases. And we were not convinced by that. So we did a study where we looked at the frequency of comorbidities, and if that to some extent was related to the systemic inflammation in our patients. This was the first finding. If you look at the different comorbidities, you see that the prevalence or the frequency is very different between the comorbidities. So anemia was only prevalent in 5% of the patients, while hypertension is present in about half of the patients, for example. And also if you look at the number of comorbidities per patient, only a few percent didn't have any comorbidities, and more than half of our patients had 4 or more unknown and untreated comorbidities. And that's the same all around the world, I'm convinced. We just don't know it. So the patients you see for your therapy are very complex patients, multimorbid patients. You should realize that. And then we looked at this cross table because we want to know if some diseases were related or co-occur with other diseases. And if I zoom in, I give you 2 examples. The obese patients, 0 of them had muscle wasting, but the majority of them had atherosclerosis. If you're underweight, almost all of them had muscle wasting. A few months before we did this analysis, I met a statistician in Austria, and she used self-organizing maps. And these self-organizing maps we applied to this data set. Just an example of creating a possibility for one of my PhD students. And what we did here, we clustered the patients based on their comorbidities. And then we had 5 clusters. The metabolic cluster, the cardiovascular cluster, the cachectic cluster, the less comorbidity cluster, and the psychological cluster. I won't go in complete detail, it gives you just one example. On those heat maps, if the patient is colored red, it means the disease is there. If the patient is colored blue, the disease is not there. And the patient is on each map at the same place. So for example, the cachectic cohort or cluster, they have underweight mostly, muscle wasting. Some of them have osteoporosis. None of them, of course, are obese. Half of them have hypertension, and so on. So by using these self-organizing maps, you can visualize how the different comorbidities are co-occurring or not. And one of the messages is that we have to create awareness amongst chest physicians that comorbidities are highly prevalent in these patients, and they co-occur in specific patterns. And of course, the main question was, is it somehow related to systemic inflammation? A quick summary on that, generally, no. So again, an example that if you work together with highly skilled statisticians who have access to these nice self-organizing maps, you can come up with nice papers. In fact, it was published even on the cover of the Blue Journal, one of the high-impact journals in the respiratory field, which made us all very proud. And then, of course, we're only here, somewhere 2020. But to know what we're going to do in the next few years, those projects must already be running. And I don't have time to discuss all these different projects. I will just address only the top two, but we have currently many ongoing projects, as you can see from here. I'd like to address two topics, health resilience topic and fatigue. Health is defined by the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical, and emotional challenges. And if you look carefully, you see a clear difference between this character and this one. What's the difference? Oh, it's the resilience. And if you want to test your patient, or let me rephrase that. If you want to test a car, you buy a new car and you drive on this road, the car drives fantastic. If you want to test your car really, you have to go to this road. You have to challenge your car, physically. And the same is with patients. We always test our patients, or mostly when they're sitting, lying, reading, or when they are at rest. But we should challenge them, physically, emotionally, or socially, and then see how they adapt to that. So we're going to do two projects on that. One just finished, one is starting. This is the one who's just starting. We are part of a larger consortium. It's called the FenFlex Consortium. And what we're going to do is to give those patients the FenFlex challenge. It's like a cup, half a liter. It's like a McDonald's meal, if you look at the number of calories. So it's high protein, high carbohydrate, high fat. And we're going to give this to patients with COPD, with and without the metabolic syndrome. And we're going to look how the body reacts to drinking that cup with all these different ingredients. And what you would expect is that the patients who have a good metabolic flexibility, that the response is not so high and the recovery is faster. And before and after rehab, we expect that after rehab that the amplitude is even smaller and the recovery is even faster. And this is one of the tests to show that as a rehab center we can improve the health, the metabolic health of our patients. So they still have symptomatic, they have still COPD, they're still perhaps symptomatic, but we can add to their health. And the same is true for physical resilience. This project just finished. We're now currently analyzing the data, so I cannot share that with you, unfortunately, at the moment. But here, this is the Grail. It's a gait analysis lab. And there are two treadmills next to each other. And when people are walking, at a certain point, you can speed of one treadmill, and you bring them out of balance. They slip away. And the patients who recover faster have a better physical resilience than those who cannot. So here we have compared 12 COPD patients and 12 healthy controls with this perturbation protocol. And we expect that the patients need more time to recover from the perturbation because they have weaker muscles. And by exercise training, we try to improve the muscle function and in that way perhaps also the physical resilience. And then the other part, a very large project we're currently doing is fatigue, general fatigue. Because fatigue is a general feeling of tiredness, of being drained of energy. And in patients with COPD, the first symptom that the doctor will ask for is, how's your dyspnea? Are you breathless? That's a fair question. But you should also ask about fatigue. I'll show you why. If you use a questionnaire and you can qualify patients as normal fatigue, moderate fatigue, or severe fatigue, see that half of the patients with COPD have severe fatigue compared to only 10% of healthy controls. So fatigue is highly prevalent. After dyspnea, symptom number 2. And if you look at the correlation between the FEV1 as a marker of disease severity and the degree of fatigue, it's a one big mess. So the degree of effort limitation does not determine the degree of severe fatigue. So there are other factors playing a role there. And we're currently doing a very large trial where we look at perpetuating factors which may perpetuate the severe fatigue in patients with COPD. So we look at systemic factors, physical, psychological, and behavioral factors. And I won't go into much detail, but we do that at 2 locations. We're including currently 400 patients, which will be followed up for 2 years, where we measure fatigue at different time points and want to see how it evaluates over time. This app I would like to share with you. I apologize for the text being in Dutch, but there's ecological momentary assessment, EMA. And you can give the app to the patients, and 8 times per day, at random moments, they get the signal. When they get the signal, they have to fill out the questionnaire. How do you feel now? Your dyspnea, your fatigue, are you anxious, and so on. We have 18 statements. You also have to explain us where they are and with whom they are. because fatigue and symptoms are context-based. By doing this, we can study the variability, day-to-day variability of symptoms. Because at this moment, we don't know. Because when you give a patient a questionnaire, how did you feel the last 2 weeks? If you ask me how I felt the last 2 weeks, it probably also goes like this. Then you get my average score. But you want to know the outliers most probably. Okay, to conclude, too much talk of my side. I showed you a lot of success stories. But it's like the top of the iceberg. Because there are also many factors that you don't see. All the different rejections that we get, the disappointments, the sacrifices that we perhaps have to make. So you have to have stamina if you want to continue in research. Perseverance. I think that's very important. And I saw once that it's about your personality, that's your trait. I don't think so. This is the MBTI profiling. You may be familiar with that. I am an ESTJ, which means that I'm energized by people, I'm very realistic, I try to make decisions based on logical analysis, and I'm very organized and stick to plans, which helps me a lot. But I know people, colleagues with completely different profiles, and they're also even equal or even more successful than I am. So I'm convinced that your different personality traits may not be the limitation, the barrier for success. To conclude, I'm sorry, Mr. Dean, but I'm going to do a job announcement. If you are at the level of I have to take the opportunity. If you are at the level of a postdoc, and Kansas is a fantastic city, but you still want to leave, you may want to look at this website. Because at Hasselt University we have now 4 opportunities, and next year there will be the 5th on exercise physiology. But we have now one on neurophysiology, musculoskeletal, neurological, and patient experience in relationship to rehab. So if you fit the profile, don't hesitate to contact us. They will give you more explanation. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. If there are questions, I'm very happy to address them. Thank you very much. Sorry, Emmanuel.
Well, the one thing I learned today is be careful who you invite. They may spend your money to come and poach your faculty. Well, yes, we have some questions.
So a question. So where you work, it sounds like a different structure than an academic environment. I mean, in academic environments, people are there, tend to get their own grants and then make collaborations. But it sounds different from your situation.
We are doing the combination of the two. So we have dedicated clinical staff, we have dedicated research staff, and they are integrated. So, for example, our medical doctors, they have their clinical shifts, their clinical duties, but also part of their time is reserved specifically for doing research, to apply for grants, to supervise Ph.D. students, to go out around the world and give talks, and to promote what we're doing, to promote the center, and so on. So that's why it's important that the board of directors has a vision on this. And if the board of directors thinks it's very important that the medical staff and others are going outside the walls of the clinic to promote the research we're doing, you have to invest time and money in that. And that's something that makes probably the biggest difference with the regular clinical faculty versus what we have.
Yeah, I think that's in here in situations in the United States, that's difficult. I mean, because our physicians have to see patients, it brings in revenue. But I think you're right, the overseers are the ones to make those decisions, and in the long term, it's probably a better thing.
Yeah, not all the physicians in our center are having an academic ambition or career. But those who want to have an academic career get the opportunity. So I think that's really something that's attractive for those physicians, or else if they only have to do clinic, it may be even a little bit boring for them. I think the combination is very interesting also for them.
Yeah. Questions?
So you're 45.
That's the easiest question I had in the last 20 years.
So,
and to be honest,
just wait.
And to be honest, I have to turn 45 in August. But okay.
Dude, what's your biggest maybe not regret, but biggest do-over wish? If I had to do something over again, what would I do differently?
Ooh. That's a
See, I told you.
That's a very tough question.
Easiest, then the toughest.
Retrospectively, I think my career path is fantastic, and would have been completely different, for example, if I would have obtained my grant to be working at the intensive care unit. At that time, I was very disappointed I didn't get the grant. Now I'm happy I didn't get it. And there are many examples like this. And you're at the crossroads where you want to go left, and for whatever reason you cannot go, you go to the right, and you end up with other opportunities. So I think at the end you'll find your path. And if I really have to, well, sometimes reviewers ask for things that you're like, oh shit, I could have added that easily. You learn from that also. And that's, for example, reading research grants for scientific committees of different charities. For grant applicants, that's very, very good to do. Because then you start reading all the details. You realize that your own grants can be much improved, for example. The other thing that's also interesting, but I don't regret, but what I didn't mention at all, but it should be mentioned, we have a patient advisory board for all our trials. So patients are consulted and asked, do you think this is relevant to you? What would you like to be seen that we study? But also written patient information we give to them is easy enough to read and so on. So I forgot to mention it in my presentation, but it's a very important part of the research. We get them involved also at a very early stage.
Thank you.
So I'm sure many of you would wonder why the choice of Dr. Spruit to speak at our leadership series. And that's because really I have known him for a very long time. I'm surprised that he even had grants that he applied for and he did not get. All I know is once we were students, it was clear-cut he had a vision that he always wanted to be a leader in whatever field he chose. And he worked hard at it, and I am not surprised at the level of success he has accomplished even in such a short time. But I think for us, and this is one of the things I try to speak of in the health professions, there are several routes to a particular destination. It does not have to follow one pathway. The fact that A did it that way does not mean B has to do it that way.
May I add something to that? Because when I was at high school, I was probably on average a grade D student. My wife studied in the US, so she makes fun of me on that part. So she says, well, you probably talk to all grade A students, so that could be. But even if you start a little bit lower, slower, you can make it.
To the top.
And another thing I want to point out, I have more applications rejected than accepted. That's part of the journey.
Yes.
If you cannot stand that, you shouldn't start it.
Exactly.
That's, I think, very important.
And again, it's all about persistence. And if you really want to break new grounds, you should be ready to face a lot of obstacles. But it is never giving up. But I think one of the things that I take away from his presentation is actually the title. You can do a lot by yourself, but you go much further when you work with other people. Collaboration is really very important. Picking the right people, knowing when to say yes, knowing when to say no, and moving forward. And I just hope this is, I'm glad the way he tied life's experience with research that he did, with his growth, and I hope that everyone has found something in the presentation today. The other reason we invited Dr. Spruit is we have a very big, very good collaborator amongst us, and that is Dr. Matthias Salate, who is our chair of internal medicine. From the moment he was interviewing, and now he's always expressed a strong desire for collaboration with our school and has continued to help us in many ways. And of course, he's a pulmonologist and he is in cystic fibrosis. And I just could think of how could we help our Department of Respiratory Care collaborate with the school of, with the Department of Internal Medicine. And of course, his name came up again. Actually, it was Dr. Burnett who asked me, do you know that name? And I said, as much as I hate to accept, yes, I do. And that's how it's here.
A photo of you here, if you want.
Oh, my goodness.
No,
Oh, yeah.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Be nice then.
Be nice, yeah. I had afro.
That's another way to fund research.
I can only talk about my own hair and move from here to there. So it's
You know, but again, getting Dr. Spruit out of his busy schedule, we've rescheduled this a couple of times and eventually we got this time. But it would not have been possible without the support of the Department of Internal Medicine. And so I really want us to show appreciations to Dr. Martijn Salate because he co-sponsored his visit here, and he's invested a lot in getting Dr. Spruit to come as well. And I just want to say, Dr. Martijn Salate, thank you very much for what you've done. So I'm going to invite Dr. Martijn Salate, and together we're going to present Dr. Spruit's our token of appreciation for the time and for the fantastic presentation that he has given. Dr. Salate. Wow. So it reads, the University of Kansas School of Health Professions wishes to express our most sincere gratitude to Martijn Spruit, Ph.D., for sharing his knowledge, insight, and lessons learned during a distinguished higher education leadership lecture. The School of Health Professions Dean's Leadership Series, today, February 11th, 2020, at the University of Kansas Medical Center, Kansas City. So on behalf of the school and on behalf of all of you, I, together with Dr. Salate, present this token of our appreciation to Dr. Spruit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, for sure. Thank you.
So it's tallest, taller, tall.
See you this afternoon?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
You want to say something?
No, I'm good.
All right, thank you and have a good afternoon.
You put me on the spot.
Matthias. That's what good people get. They get put on the spot all the time.